Actually, deducing these things is quite simple. Sherlock pointed to Harry's glasses and explained, "No normal family would let you enter a new school still wearing glasses that are broken and have been taped multiple times with transparent tape. Your clothes are neat, showing you have good personal habits, but the style is outdated and obviously doesn't fit. They hang loosely on you, much too large for your frame, so I guess they should be hand-me-downs from your cousin. The old trunk beside you is covered with bumps and wear marks, clearly showing the passage of time, indicating it has served for many years. Since it's a cousin, your relatives could only be an uncle, aunt, or other relation. According to The Rise and Fall of the Dark Arts and Important Magical Events of the 20th Century, your only remaining relative is your mother's sister, so I deduced you must be living with your aunt and uncle. From these, it's easy to infer how they treat you." "What did you say I mentioned in books?" Harry looked incredulous. Sherlock stared at him. "It seems you haven't read your books properly. In fact, I know almost everything about you." The shock on Harry's face deepened. Sherlock smiled at him. "Not just those 2 books, A History of Magic by Bathilda Bagshot, which is required reading for first years, also mentions you." Harry suddenly felt dizzy. He steadied himself and couldn't help asking again, "Then, how did you know it was Uncle Vernon who brought me today?" "I was just getting to that, if you hadn't interrupted me." "Oh, sorry." Harry quickly apologized. He always seemed to mess things up without realizing it. "It's fine, as long as you don't interrupt me again. Your loose-fitting shirt has a mark on the lower right corner where it was caught by a car door. As for why I can tell it was caught by a car door and not something else, it's because different angles and amounts of force create different effects. Clearly, this mark was made by the right door of a car. From your speech and the clothing situation I just described, I can see you're a self-disciplined person, so you shouldn't have been late today under normal circumstances, yet you were late. You couldn't lift your trunk by yourself just now, and considering your description of that terrible relative, it's not hard to determine his actions. He wasn't willing to bring you here in the first place. He only brought you to the station to see you make a fool of yourself. For someone coming here for the first time, without careful observation skills, it's difficult to discover that Platform 9 3/4 is located between Platform 9 and Platform 10. Sorry, but from my observations, you don't yet possess such abilities, so your ability to get here could only have been due to help from others." Sherlock spoke very quickly, about twice the normal speed. This was mainly because he felt these matters really didn't need much analysis. Although the information seemed extensive, the evidence was as obvious as ink splattered on white paper. Of course, there were some things he didn't mention, like how he had spotted Harry the moment he entered the platform and had also deduced who had helped him get to the platform. After Sherlock finished explaining, it took Harry several more minutes to fully understand the meaning, and he couldn't help exclaiming, "Brilliant!" Sherlock shrugged. He truly didn't think this small skill was worth showing off or praise. His attitude made Harry admire him even more. Just as Harry was about to say something more to express his admiration, the compartment door suddenly slid open, and a red-haired head poked in. "Excuse me, everywhere else is full. May I sit here?" Harry immediately looked at Sherlock. The red-haired boy's gaze also followed Harry's to Sherlock. "Of course, Mr. Ron Weasley." "Thank you." The redhead agreed, but after dragging his trunk into the compartment, he suddenly realized something and asked in surprise, "Wait, how do you know who I am?" "If you want to hide your identity," Sherlock said, pointing while both Harry and Ron looked at him curiously, "I'd advise you not to wear a name tag on your trunk in the future, or at least don't face it toward people when you're talking to them." The red-haired boy looked down and was stunned. He had completely forgotten about this. This person seems quite impressive. Seeing the red-haired boy's expression, Harry immediately felt much better psychologically. So it wasn't that he was too stupid, it was that Sherlock was too brilliant. While Harry was secretly pleased, the boy had already sat down beside Harry. He mainly felt Sherlock's aura was a bit intimidating, so he chose to sit next to the other person. Facing Sherlock, Ron's performance wasn't much better than Harry's had been. He was equally nervous. In this situation, Sherlock naturally held absolute control. He was also somewhat interested in Ron. According to records, the Weasley family was one of the sacred 28 pure-blood families and had a long history in the wizarding world. Red hair was a distinctive feature of their family. The so-called Sacred 28 were families that possessed pure or nearly pure wizarding bloodlines. This was also knowledge covered in A History of Magic. Originally, he had planned to use Harry as his entry point for understanding the magical world. But from his interaction with Harry just now, Harry Potter, who had grown up in an ordinary family, knew even less about the magical world than he did after reading books for a month. In this situation, Ron, who came from the Weasley family, was actually a very suitable choice. "I'm Sherlock Holmes. Just call me Sherlock." After introducing himself, Sherlock pointed and said, "This is Harry Potter." After saying this, he stopped. He had already guessed Ron's next reaction. Ron didn't disappoint him. "Harry Potter? Wait, you said he's Harry Potter. That Harry Potter?" Ron's voice rose suddenly. He immediately realized this wasn't appropriate and quickly lowered his voice, looking at Harry in disbelief. "You're that Harry Potter?" Ron stared directly at Harry. Obviously, this revelation surprised him more than Sherlock's earlier deduction of his identity. Noticing that Harry's face was getting redder under Ron's gaze and that he couldn't say a word, Sherlock simply answered Ron's question for Harry, "Obviously." This made both Harry and Ron sigh with relief, and Harry looked at Sherlock gratefully. "This is incredible. I'm actually in the same compartment as Harry Potter." Although he already knew from books that Harry's influence was enormous, Ron's reaction was the first time Sherlock had witnessed this confirmed in reality. It was getting more and more interesting. At this point, Harry lifted his hair from his forehead, showing his scar to both Sherlock and Ron. Ron stared in amazement. "Is that what you know who did?" "Yes," Harry nodded, "but I can't remember it." Ron asked urgently again, "Nothing at all?" "Well, I remember lots of green light, but nothing else." "Green light? What's that?" "I don't know either." The Scarlet Locomotive released a final whistle as it pulled away from King's Cross Station. Steam wafted past the windows in great white clouds, and the bustling London platform gradually faded into a blur of waving hands and tearful goodbyes. The Scottish countryside began to appear beyond the glass. In their compartment, the initial awkwardness between Harry and Ron had melted away. What had begun as tentative introductions had blossomed into an enthusiastic exchange of stories and questions. At this point, Harry and Ron were no longer as reserved as when they first met. Especially Harry. He found that both he and Ron were very interested in each other's families. "So, you really didn't know about any of this?" Ron asked incredulously, gesturing. "Quidditch, chocolate frogs, Bertie Bott's every flavor beans, nothing?" Harry shook his head. They questioned each other back and forth, rapidly deepening their understanding. Sherlock didn't join in. Just from listening to their conversation, he had enough information to make deductions about both of them. Instead, he was more interested in the lightning-shaped scar on Harry's forehead. Of course, in Sherlock's view, the scar looked more like a capital N than the legendary lightning bolt. Harry and Ron were getting more and more excited in their conversation. Ron, carried away by enthusiasm, decided to show these two friends from Muggle families some magic. "Actually," Ron said, lowering his voice and glancing toward the compartment door, "I could show you a bit of magic right now. George taught me a spell that can turn it yellow." "That's Scabbers," Ron explained, noticing Harry's curious gaze. "He's been in the family for ages. Used to be Percy's, that's my brother who just made prefect, but he got an owl for becoming prefect, so Scabbers got passed down to me." After saying these things, Ron opened his trunk and began rummaging through it. The inside of the trunk was quite messy. He moved aside a pile of books, pulled out 2 robes, and after a long time finally extracted a wand. "Want to see some real magic?" Ron asked. Holding up the old wand, his eyes shone with the anticipation of finally being the one with knowledge to share, rather than the continuous recipient of hand-me-downs and second-hand stories. "Absolutely," Harry replied immediately, leaning forward with undisguised eagerness. Sherlock also turned his attention to the upcoming demonstration, though his interest was of a more analytical nature. During the summer holidays, he had tried many spells and had succeeded with all of them. By reasonable judgment, his magical talent should be quite good. However, he was powerless when it came to transfiguration, like McGonagall turning a teacup into a squirrel. Of course, after reading the textbooks, Sherlock also knew that wasn't first-year curriculum. It was beyond the syllabus. Under his two friends' gazes, Ron cleared his throat and waved his wand. Right then, Ron announced solemnly, as if he were about to perform the most complex magic in existence. "Here goes, sunshine, daisies, buttermellow, turn this stupid, fat rat yellow." The incantation hung in the air with all the dramatic weight Ron had intended. 1 second passed. Then another. Then a third. Scabbers continued his peaceful sleep, his gray fur showing not the slightest hint of yellow transformation. His tiny chest rose and fell with a steady rhythm of undisturbed sleep. "Harry, degree. Sherlock, underscore." Harry's expression shifted from eager anticipation to polite confusion, his eyebrows climbing toward his hairline as he tried to process what he had, or rather, hadn't, witnessed. Sherlock's face remained neutral, though the slight tightening around his eyes suggested he was drawing conclusions from this magical failure. Undeterred by this initial setback, Ron adjusted his grip on the wand and tried again, putting extra emphasis into his pronunciation. "Sunshine, daisies, buttermellow, turn this stupid, fat rat yellow." Once again, absolutely nothing happened. Scabbers continued his nap with admirable dedication, apparently immune to Ron's magical efforts. The silence in the compartment grew increasingly awkward as the seconds ticked by. "Harry, Omega. Sherlock, underscore." Harry's face now showed a complex mixture of disappointment and second-hand embarrassment. He desperately wanted to say something encouraging, but had no frame of reference for whether this was normal magical behavior or a complete disaster. "Well," Ron said finally, his face flushing red as he lowered his wand in defeat, "I always suspected that spell was complete rubbish. George probably knew it was a fake all along. He's always playing pranks like that." He attempted a laugh, but it came out rather forced and hollow. It was at this moment that Sherlock's voice cut through the uncomfortable silence. "Is it the wand that's the problem?" Ron looked up sharply, confusion replacing embarrassment. "What do you mean?" "Your second eldest brother's wand," Sherlock clarified, nodding toward the pointing at wand in Ron's hand. The wand was very worn, with some parts peeling off, and one end was gleaming white. "Oh, this is Charlie's old wand. The unicorn hair is almost showing, but Dad says that won't affect its use." Ron carefully touched the worn wand, then suddenly looked up. "Wait just a minute," Ron stammered, his voice climbing in pitch. "How could you possibly know this was my brother's old wand?" "Ron, even I can tell it's an old wand," Harry couldn't help saying. He was secretly pleased, vaguely feeling his intelligence had gained the high ground. No. I mean, how did you know it was my second eldest brother's wand? I haven't told you how many brothers I have yet." "That's right." Only then did Harry realize. He could indeed tell it was an old wand, but Sherlock had directly stated it was Ron's second eldest brother's. Wasn't this too outrageous? Sherlock smiled. "Actually, I know quite a bit more than that. I also know your family has 7 children in total. You're currently wearing your eldest brother's robes, using your second eldest brother's wand, caring for your third brother's pet, your fourth and fifth brothers are twins, and you have a younger sister who hasn't started Hogwarts yet." The silence that followed this statement was deafening. Both Harry and Ron stared at Sherlock as if he had just announced he could read minds, which, given the accuracy of his deductions, seemed like the only rational explanation. Neither could speak for quite a while. Finally, Ron's face turned red as he muttered, "Sherlock, it's no fun tricking people like this. You must have investigated me beforehand." Harry, despite his previous experience with Sherlock's deductive abilities, found himself nodding in agreement. "He's right, Sherlock. You had to have known about Ron's family before we got on the train. There's no way anyone could figure out that much information just from looking at someone." At this moment, the two had formed a united front, certain that Sherlock had investigated Ron beforehand. Sherlock observed their reactions with the patient amusement of a teacher watching students struggle with a concept that seemed basic to him. This wasn't the first time his deductive abilities had been met with accusations of trickery, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. "My dear friends, what I've just done is actually quite simple and straightforward. Anyone with sufficient powers of observation and logical reasoning could reach the same conclusions. Think back to my earlier analysis of you, Harry. Once I explained my reasoning process, didn't it seem almost simple? Once I explain the deduction process, you'll even say, 'Ah, so it's that simple.'" Harry was somehow half convinced. "Really? I still don't believe it," Ron declared firmly, shaking his head so vigorously that his red hair flopped about like flames in a strong wind. "You definitely investigated my family somehow. Nobody could possibly know all that just from meeting me on a train." Compared to Ron, Harry's reaction was better. After all, he had witnessed this once before. But now he was equally skeptical. After all, the information Sherlock had deduced about Ron was so detailed it couldn't compare to his earlier deduction about Harry. Seeing both pairs of eyes filled with curiosity, Sherlock smiled and said, "Very well then, let me walk you through the reasoning process step by step. Ron's robes, his wand, his textbooks, even his trunk, all show significant wear and use by previous owners. I am sorry, when you opened your trunk earlier, Ron, I couldn't help but notice the condition of your belongings. This immediately suggests a family with multiple children, where items are passed down from older siblings to younger ones." Ron shifted uncomfortably but couldn't argue with the observation. "Next, let's examine the robes more closely. They've obviously been altered, let down at the hems, taken in at the seams, but they still don't fit properly. I suspect when you change into them later, those sneakers you're wearing will be clearly visible beneath the shortened hem. The alterations suggest these robes have been adjusted for someone significantly shorter than their original owner." Harry glanced down at Ron's feet and realized Sherlock was absolutely right about the sneakers. The old wand is too obvious. Even Harry could tell just now. Sherlock continued, "Harry, asterisk. But that doesn't prove the wand belonged to my second brother." Ron couldn't help saying. Sherlock shrugged. Generally speaking, in wizarding families, wands and school robes are typically purchased together when a child starts Hogwarts. The fact that these items show different patterns of wear suggests they came from different brothers. Since items are only passed down when the original owner no longer needs them, meaning they've graduated, we know that at least 2 of Ron's brothers have already finished their Hogwarts education. "But how did you know which brother was which?" Harry asked, genuinely curious now despite his lingering skepticism. "It's simple, my dear Harry. When Ron tried to show us magic, he mentioned that Scabbers here," Sherlock gestured toward the still sleeping rat, "was given to him by his brother who became prefect. He also mentioned that George taught him the spell he was attempting. This tells us Ron has at least 2 additional brothers currently at school. It was a coincidence that I saw Ron talking with a pair of twin brothers on this train. No one would doubt whether they are family, with the same red hair and similar facial features. But neither of them is a prefect. Prefects are in the 2 specially designated compartments at the front, which isn't hard to find out about. Based on all this information, deducing this isn't difficult, is it?" Ron's mouth was hanging open now as the logical chain became clear. "Look, from this information I can easily deduce that you have 5 brothers, with robes and wand coming from your graduated eldest and second eldest brothers respectively. The third brother who became prefect passed down his pet, and the 4th and 5th brothers are the twins I saw. 5 brothers minimum, with Ron being the youngest." "But how did you know I have a sister?" Ron asked weakly, though he seemed to know the answer was coming. Sherlock's smile became somewhat apologetic. "You probably didn't notice, but you have several long red hairs on your shoulder. Judging from the texture and color, the age should be similar to yours. So, you should have either a sister or an older sister, with a younger sister being more likely. This is the only piece of information I guessed rather than reasoned, but I think this guess should be correct. I think she hasn't started school yet." After Sherlock finished explaining his entire deductive process in one breath, Harry and Ron were left stunned and speechless. After a moment, it was Harry, who had already witnessed Sherlock's abilities, who reacted first. "That was brilliant. Sherlock, you really are amazing. When you put it like that, it all seems so obvious." "See, I knew you'd say that, dear Harry." Sherlock shrugged, then turned to Ron with serious advice. "If you can manage it, you should really get a new one. Old books and robes don't matter much, but a wand should be suited to its owner. Otherwise, it will affect your spellcasting and magic learning." Ron's face turned red. "It's fine. Though it's a bit old, my brother's wand handles quite well." Sherlock understood. "No money." Out of admiration for Sherlock's abilities, Harry and Ron changed the subject and began earnestly asking for his guidance. Only then did the two learn that Sherlock called this method of reasoning deduction. It was a method based on observation, analysis, and logical reasoning. Through keen attention to various details, combined with knowledge and logical rules to make inferences, one could draw conclusions about events, people, and many other aspects. To use it skillfully required broad knowledge across many fields, meticulous observation, and the comprehensive application of both inductive and deductive reasoning. Although Sherlock claimed that with proper training, anyone could master the skill, Harry and Ron shook their heads repeatedly. Come on, this was clearly a natural talent, impossible to learn. But this didn't dampen their discussion. Just as the atmosphere was becoming increasingly lively, someone knocked on the compartment door. Two young wizards appeared before the three of them. Sherlock happened to recognize both. One was a boy with a round face. He was actually one of Sherlock's deductive subjects while waiting at the station. At the time, Sherlock's assessment had been, first-year student, parents absent for unknown reasons, raised by grandmother, forgetful, timid, lacking confidence. However, seeing his tear-streaked face now, even without Sherlock's analysis, Harry and Ron could tell he was both sad and aggrieved. As for the other, brown bushy hair, slightly large front teeth, arrogant expression, it was none other than Hermione Granger, whom Sherlock had encountered outside the Leaky Cauldron before school started. Unlike Sherlock's group, Hermione had already changed into her new robes. "Have any of you seen a toad? Longbottom's lost his toad." Her tone, combined with that expression, made her seem rather self-important and condescending. Harry was fine with it, but Ron immediately frowned. Just then, Hermione heard a familiar voice. "We haven't seen any toad, Miss Granger." Harry and Ron immediately looked at Sherlock in surprise. Ron couldn't help but ask, "Wait, how did you figure that out this time? She's not carrying a trunk." He tried to observe Hermione the way Sherlock did, looking for clues that would reveal her identity. Naturally, his efforts were futile. Sherlock shook his head. "We've met before." So, they knew each other already. This explanation put Harry and Ron at ease. They'd almost thought Sherlock had once again deduced a person's identity just from looking at them. That would have been too extraordinary. Seeing Sherlock, with whom she'd had a brief encounter, Hermione was somewhat surprised. Unlike Harry and Ron, she was naturally outgoing. It was only because Sherlock's initial impression had been so striking that she'd seemed shy. Now, a month later, she'd returned to her original personality and couldn't help exclaiming, "Holmes, what are you doing here?" After saying this, she sat down in the empty seat beside Sherlock. Not just Harry and Ron, but even Sherlock was caught off guard by Hermione's boldness. He was somewhat puzzled. Were he and Hermione really that familiar? They'd only met once. But this was just the beginning. Hermione's next performance showed Sherlock's group what it meant to be truly socially fearless. "Oh, I was going to call you earlier, but I got busy and forgot. Have you finished reading those textbooks?" Faced with Hermione's greeting as if they were old friends, Sherlock nodded. "I finished them." "I knew it." Hermione's eyes lit up as she began talking non-stop. "Have you tried any spells?" "I tried a few simple ones at home, just for practice, and they all worked. Also, I forgot to mention last time, nobody in my family knows about magic, so when I got my Hogwarts letter, I was shocked but also thrilled. From what I understand, this is the finest school of witchcraft and wizardry. I've already memorized all the textbooks, though I hope that'll be enough." Once she started talking, she couldn't stop, speaking in a torrent of words. Just like with Neville earlier, even without Sherlock's analysis, Harry and Ron could already judge what kind of person this girl was. "I don't want to be sorted into the same house as her, no matter which one it is," Ron thought to himself. But then Hermione's attention turned to the wand in his hand that he hadn't had time to put away. "Oh, are you doing magic? Well, let's see it then." Ron immediately felt at a loss. His spell hadn't worked earlier. It was one thing to embarrass himself in front of Sherlock and Harry. After all, Ron considered them his people now. But in front of Granger and Longbottom. Looking at the round-faced boy with tears in his eyes, then at the girl staring at him expectantly, he instinctively turned to Sherlock for help. At the same time, Harry also looked hopefully at Sherlock. "Please help us out, sir." Sherlock understood their pleading looks. "Ron's wand has some issues." "Let me do it." Sherlock drew his wand and pointed it at Harry's glasses, waving it gently. Reparo. A series of fine crackling sounds followed, and Harry's glasses, which had been taped together many times, became completely new before everyone's eyes. Harry was immediately stunned. He removed his glasses with disbelief, examining them carefully. Ron leaned in too, and both discovered that the glasses had truly returned to their factory-new condition, completely restored. Hermione also looked at Sherlock in surprise. The mending charm could repair damaged objects, returning them to their original state. Hermione could perform it herself, but she could see that Sherlock's proficiency exceeded even her own. Combined with how he'd instantly identified her parents as dentists outside the leaky cauldron, this gave the perpetual top student a sudden sense of crisis. Hermione cleared her throat, preparing to comment on Sherlock's spellcasting, when she suddenly noticed the scar on Harry's forehead after he'd removed his glasses. She asked in surprise, "You're Harry Potter? The boy who killed you know who?" Harry paused, then replied, Well, I mean I am, but Voldemort didn't die. He should still be alive." Sherlock frowned. This touched on his knowledge-blind spot. "Harry, you're saying Voldemort is still alive?" "Yes, Hagrid told me so. Though he's weakened beyond recovery, he probably didn't actually die." And so, Sherlock, Harry, and Hermione began discussing Voldemort openly and without restraint, as if no one else was there, while Ron and Neville sat trembling in terrified silence. In the last car of the Hogwarts Express, listening to Sherlock, Harry, and Hermione loudly discussing the forbidden topic, Neville Longbottom even forgot about finding his pet. Several times he wanted to speak up, but the words died on his trembling lips. Ron watched the three's normal conversation, hesitating repeatedly as well. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, he mustered the courage to interrupt them. Wait a minute. You're actually saying you know whose name? What else would we do?" Sherlock looked at Ron, who could barely breathe, and Neville, who literally couldn't breathe, asking curiously, "Are you very afraid?" He knew the wizarding world was taboo about Voldemort's name, otherwise the books wouldn't refer to him as he who must not be named. But he hadn't expected that after more than 10 years, his influence still lingered. Just mentioning the name had left both boys unable to cope. Seeing Ron and Neville nod frantically, Hermione couldn't help asking curiously, "Why be afraid?" "Well, it's because—" Ron wanted to answer, but suddenly realized he couldn't explain the issue clearly. After thinking for a moment, he murmured, "Mum and Dad have used it to frighten me since I was little. All wizarding children are told by their parents that this person's name is forbidden. Unless absolutely necessary, I don't want to mention his name. I mean, no one wants to." Neville nodded repeatedly beside him, indicating he felt the same way. Ron looked at Harry with admiration. "But thinking about it, that makes sense, considering it's you." Harry hesitated for a moment but still explained. "Saying his name isn't because I'm brave or anything. It's because I never knew that name couldn't be said. Do you understand what I mean?" Hermione nodded in agreement. For those from non-magical families, it really was like that. "What Voldemort? That wasn't as scary as Mom calling me by my full name." "It can all be said. There's nothing that can't be said." Under their surprised gazes, Sherlock said calmly, "Fear comes from the unknown. The best way to eliminate fear is to face it." Seeing Ron and Neville cowering, putting their head in chest, Sherlock offered a direct solution. Harry and Hermione nodded repeatedly. Ron and Neville looked at Sherlock with worship. Amazing! But that was as far as it went. Even though they thought Sherlock was absolutely right, their upbringing still wouldn't allow them to follow suit. Hermione and Neville stayed in the compartment a while longer, until a smiling woman opened the door asking if anyone wanted to buy snacks. Only then did the two get up to leave, continuing their search for Neville's toad. Before leaving, Hermione reminded Ron that he should really get a new wand, since using an old wand could very likely result in spellcasting failures. Ron. Strangely enough, when Sherlock had said the same thing, Ron could accept it. But coming from Hermione's mouth, Ron found it extremely annoying. "No matter which house I'm sorted into, I don't want to be in the same one as her." As soon as Hermione left, Ron voiced his true feelings. Harry nodded absent-mindedly. His attention was still on Sherlock. This new friend he'd just met was simply too amazing. By now, Sherlock had moved to stand before the snack trolley witch. He gazed curiously at these snacks he'd never seen before. Just from their appearance, these little treats were brimming with magical atmosphere. Such seemingly insignificant things represented exactly why he'd thrown himself into the magical world in the first place. "Did you bring lunch?" Sherlock looked toward Harry and Ron. Harry shook his head. To be fair, aside from punishments, the Dursleys hadn't let Harry starve. But they'd never really let him eat his fill either. Cousin Dudley always grabbed whatever he wanted to eat. Under these circumstances, they naturally wouldn't pack him lunch. Ron mumbled quietly that he'd brought sandwiches. Seeing his reddening ears, Sherlock immediately understood. He wanted to eat but had no money. Without saying much more, Sherlock asked about prices and bought some of everything. The total came to less than 12 silver sickles. Not expensive, but not exactly cheap either. "I'm treating everyone to lunch, though these are all snacks, so Ron, let me have your sandwiches first to fill up a bit." Hearing Sherlock say this, Ron nodded eagerly in agreement. His mother always forgot that he didn't like corned beef. Sherlock's suggestion suited him perfectly. Besides, for him, the snacks were far more appealing than corned beef sandwiches anyway. Harry nodded without much hesitation. This was the first time a peer had shared food with him, and the feeling was wonderful. Through their interactions, Sherlock had already figured out both their personalities completely. Harry seemed withdrawn and introverted on the surface, but subconsciously he was strong and brave, so his confident nature allowed him to accept Sherlock's kindness graciously. Ron, who seemed carefree on the surface, had actually lived in the shadow of 5 excellent older brothers and was somewhat insecure inside. If Sherlock had directly offered to treat him to food, he definitely would have found it hard to accept. But phrasing it differently, like this exchange arrangement, made him feel perfectly comfortable. Besides, Sherlock wasn't lying. He genuinely felt they should have some proper food before the snacks. He was pleased to find that Mrs. Weasley was quite a good cook. The beef was delicious. Next, the three began feasting, and the compartment was soon filled with the aroma of good food. Ron also began showing off his specialty, introducing Sherlock and Harry to various magically themed snacks. For instance, chocolate frogs weren't real frogs but shaped chocolate bars with cream filling. Rich milk flavor, silky texture, pure, smooth, and easily melting, they provided consumers with an entirely new taste experience. They tasted quite good, and young wizards loved them. However, Sherlock and Harry were more interested in the trading cards that came with these little treats. Each chocolate frog package included a card featuring famous wizards' portrait photos on the front and biographical information on the back. Harry got a card of Hogwarts headmaster Dumbledore. Magical world photographs were different from non-magical ones. People photographed would actually move. So, when Harry finished reading Dumbledore's biography and flipped the card to the front, he was startled to find Dumbledore's face had disappeared. "Well, you can't expect him to hang around all day," Ron explained casually, seeing Harry's surprise. When Harry told Ron that people in non-magical photographs never changed once taken, it was Ron's turn to be amazed. "You mean they just don't move? How weird." While they talked, Dumbledore wandered back into the frame. Harry couldn't help praising, "This is so amazing. Sherlock, aren't you surprised?" Sherlock bit into a chocolate frog. The taste really was excellent. He took Harry's card, watching the white-bearded old man disappear and reappear, and smiled. "This sort of thing can actually be done without magic too." In 1987, a bitmap file format called GIF was born. This new format achieved dynamic image display functionality, with effects essentially equivalent to the character cards in Chocolate Frogs. In 1989, the GIF format received a version update, truly achieving animation capabilities. In this respect alone, it was even more advanced than the magical world's portraits. Sherlock's explanation once again amazed Harry and Ron with his vast knowledge. The two exchanged glances, feeling that this new first-year student like them seemed to know everything. Though, this was just a small interval. In any case, the Chocolate Frogs not only gave Sherlock and Harry a Dumbledore card, but after trading, they even collected cards of Morgana, Hengist, Alberic, Circe, Paracelsus, and Merlin. With incredible luck, they each drew an SSR rare card. Kwong Pa and Bowman Wright. The former was a 15th-century dragonologist who discovered the uses of Chinese fireball dragon egg powder. The later was professional metal charmer, highly gifted and skillful with charm work, as he was also the inventor of the famous golden snitch used in Quidditch. Ron was quite envious. These things were hard currency among Hogwarts students. Some rare cards could even be traded for a week's worth of homework. His own Quang-Pa card was a gift from his second brother Charlie, who worked with dragons in Romania. As for Bowman Wright, that had been taken from his brother by trading. Hearing this, Sherlock showed a thoughtful expression. It seemed that in this regard, magical schools weren't much different from ordinary ones. Next, Ron warned Sherlock and Harry about another snack, Bertie Bott's Every Flavor beans. Every flavor truly meant every flavor, all tastes were represented. Not only traditional candy flavors like chocolate, peppermint, and marmalade, but also non-food tastes like leather, paint, and dirt. Even more extreme were stimulating flavors like boogers, earwax, and various bodily functions. After brief consideration, Sherlock realized that with technological advancement, the non-magical world could actually achieve this too. But there was really no need to. However, through his conversation with Ron, he found the intersection of magic and science quite fascinating indeed. Just as Harry was mustering courage to lick a strange gray bean that even Ron dared not touch, the compartment door was pushed open once again. This time, 3 young boys appeared before Sherlock. The one in the middle had pale blonde hair that was almost white, and was quite handsome, though his complexion was rather pale. Flanking him were 2 tall and short, unattractive fat boys. Though not good-looking, they were quite sturdy. These 2 subtly flanked the boy in a protective formation, like bodyguards. Against their backdrop, the boy appeared even more striking, his pale complexion giving him an almost sickly complexion. In terms of looks alone, even Sherlock paled in comparison. With just one glance, Sherlock guessed his identity. The Malfoy family. Like the Weasley family, hair was also a distinguishing feature of the Malfoys. The former had red hair, the latter platinum blonde. Meanwhile, like the Weasleys, the Malfoys were also part of the sacred 28 pure-blood families. However, Sherlock wasn't the only one who recognized Malfoy at this moment. Noticing Harry and Ron's expressions, Sherlock was somewhat surprised. He looked at Harry. "You know him." It wasn't strange for Ron to recognize Malfoy, they were from the same circles, after all. But Harry supposedly had no connection with him. Harry was also confused. He didn't understand how Sherlock could tell, but he nodded anyway. He had indeed recognized this pale boy with light blonde hair. They'd met briefly at Madame Malkin's robe shop in Diagon Alley when ordering robes. Harry's impression of him hadn't been good even then, because he'd spoken arrogantly and looked down on Hagrid. And Hagrid was truly his first real friend after all these years. The boy had already begun speaking. "People all over the train have been talking about Harry Potter being in this compartment." Clearly, he too recognized Harry from their previous encounter and was now looking at him with much greater interest than in Diagon Alley. "So that's you, is it?" Harry nodded instinctively. Since this was Harry's acquaintance, Sherlock didn't plan to get involved. But after surveying the compartment, the boy's gaze settled on him, saying contemptuously, "I never expected the famous Harry Potter to be sitting with stinking mudbloods. How disappointing." Ron's expression immediately changed. Malfoy continued his introduction. "I'm Malfoy, Draco Malfoy. This is Crabbe, and this is Goyle. I came here to—" Before he could finish, a cold laugh interrupted him. It came from Ron. Malfoy immediately turned his head, eyes fixed on Ron, his gaze undisguisedly disgusted. "You find what I said amusing, do you? I don't need to ask who you are. Red hair, hand-me-down robes, freckles everywhere, and too many kids to afford proper care. My father told me all Weasleys are like this, a disgrace to pure blood." Ron was instantly furious. Though Sherlock had said similar things earlier, the same words from Malfoy's mouth felt completely different. Ron reflected that when Sherlock mentioned his old robes and second-hand wand, it was in an emotionless tone, purely stating objective facts. But Malfoy was purely mocking him. However, before Ron's anger could explode, Malfoy turned back to Harry, forcing a smile while extending his hand. "You'll soon find that some wizarding families are much better than others, Potter. You don't want to go making friends with the wrong sort, or filthy mudbloods, do you? I can help you there. Clearly, Malfoy was making a considerable effort to curry favor himself with Harry. Unfortunately, his upbringing meant that even when trying to befriend someone, he maintained a condescending arrogance and swaggering presumption. If Hermione's arrogance was in her words, then his was written all over his face. More importantly, he just insulted Harry's two newly made good friends. So, his proposal was doomed to fail. Harry, who already had a poor impression of him, naturally wasn't inclined to humor him under these circumstances. He said coldly, "I think I can tell the wrong sort for myself, thanks." The smile froze on Malfoy's face. Being rejected so publicly, a faint blush appeared on his pale cheeks. He withdrew his hand that had been left hanging in the air, saying slowly, "Potter, if I were you, I'd be very careful, or you'll meet the same end as your parents. They didn't know any better either. It's because they mixed with the wrong crowd like the Weasleys or people like Hagrid that they were influenced." As soon as Malfoy finished speaking, Harry immediately stood up. Without a word, Ron also rose to his feet. His face was now as red as his hair.